So I'm Dr. Nevé Baker. I'm currently an NSF Earth Sciences postdoc with Dr. Emily Fairfax at the University of Minnesota. I'm also doing a visiting research position at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to be sharing some of my PhD work with you. I finished my PhD last year at UC Santa Cruz, where I studied ancient DNA and conservation genomics of marine and aquatic mammals. And so I'm going to share some of my results and talk a little bit about the direction I'm taking my work now, which is sort of expanding and continuing this work. So the underlying question of my research is, what did ecosystems, look, something exciting going on over there. It's exciting here too. So I'm interested in understanding what ecosystems look like in the past, and perhaps more importantly, how they function. And I'm going to particularly focus on North America today, although of course this is of interest elsewhere too. So first of all, ecosystems are dynamic. There isn't any one past state. And so the answer to what did ecosystems look like in the past varies a lot depending on when in time we're looking at and at what time scale. But our typical understanding of past North American ecosystems is usually informed by historical records and images that come from the period during and after European colonization, which was a time of intense and rapid change. So over the course of a few hundred years, the landscape was really heavily modified, forests were cleared, rivers dammed, wetlands drained, fire suppressed. Native species were eliminated or extremely depleted. So I've shown the bison here. This is a really famous image of bison skulls. So bison are a really classic example, but this also applies to predators, fur bearers, hint, hint, and anything considered an agricultural pest. And indigenous populations were devastated by violence, displacement, and disease, which also stopped or interrupted or changed any landscape management that they were doing. And so because of all of these changes, our current understanding of historic North American landscapes, which is based on just the past few centuries, may be quite biased and not really representative of an only slightly less recent past. So it can be helpful to expand our perspective and the time scale we're looking at a little bit and go into the prehistory rather than just the history. And so my research spans the Holocene, which is the last 12,000 years or so. This is the period since the last glacial period, where the climate has been relatively stable, although not completely, and modern humans have really thrived and expanded and started doing all of the things that they do to change our ecosystems. So if the historical records of North American landscapes are problematic or limited, how else can we learn about past ecosystems? So one way is with traditional ecological knowledge, tapping into the understanding of peoples that have been here before Europeans arrived, often for thousands of years. And then the other way is with empirical data. So examples of this are fossil records, tree rings, geological records, and what I use for my research, which is sediment cores from lakes. So because the lake bottoms tend to be relatively undisturbed, sediments get deposited in nice, predictable, datable layers, creating a chronology of often thousands of years. And by drilling into the bottoms of lakes, we can recover a core of this chronology, which contains a ton of information. So lake cores preserve changes in sedimentary composition, microfossils of pollen and diatoms, evidence of past wildfire through preserved charcoal, and records of disturbances like volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and landslides. And so with these data, you can build a really incredible record of the past, the climate, geography, and to a certain extent, the biodiversity, and how these change over time. And one source of data from lake cores that we've only recently learned how to recover is what's called sedimentary ancient DNA. So who here is familiar with eDNA or environmental DNA? Show of hands. All right, most people. I'm going to explain it anyway. So organisms, both living and dead, leave DNA behind in their environment. So all of you guys are leaving your DNA here as we speak. And we can recover this DNA from sediment or water and sequence potentially everything in a given environment: plants, animals, fungi, microbes. So this is eDNA or environmental DNA. And when eDNA gets buried and preserved, it becomes sedimentary ancient DNA or sedaDNA. And this is what happens at the bottoms of lakes. And so eDNA is coming from the lake itself, it's coming from headwaters and the surrounding environment, and getting buried at the bottom of lakes. And so when we go and get our lake cores, we can recover sedimentary DNA from those layers. And this is a super rich source of data. And it can give a much broader and deeper, I'd argue, understanding of past biodiversity than more traditional methods. And so by combining sedimentary DNA with these other data from lake cores, we can build quite detailed reconstructions of past ecosystems. And so this matters because our understanding of past ecosystems and ecological baselines directly informs how we manage ecosystems today. So where ecological baseline data is flawed or absent or not really representative, we can end up with misguided and sometimes harmful management. So a couple of examples here that have already been set up in some earlier talks. One is the suppression of wildfire, which leads to really destructive megafires instead of the regenerative burning, which is a natural ecosystem process. And another example is the channelization of streams and the removal of woody debris that was originally intended to improve fish passage, among other things. So high quality data on ecological baselines can inform effective management and restoration and help us avoid these kind of mistakes of the past. And so bringing this around to beavers, I don't really need to belabor the impacts of beavers to this audience. Suffice to say that beaver engineering profoundly affects local ecosystems. And so recently beavers are having a bit of a moment. There's a lot of interest in restoring and encouraging beavers for wetland restoration, and in order to benefit from all of these ecosystem services they provide, particularly in places like Colorado and California, where drought and wildfire are big concerns. But as I said before, successful ecological restoration relies on a robust understanding of ecological baselines. It's in the name, right? We're saying restoration. We're trying to restore some sort of past state, but we have to know what that past state is. And this is a bit of a gap in the world of beaver knowledge. So we know that beavers were once widespread across the continent. There's evidence that they were here building dams as long as 7 million years ago. But they were almost wiped out by the fur trade in the 18th and 19th centuries. And they've made a good recovery, but are still at perhaps less than 5% of their historic abundance. And there's just not that much known about beavers before the fur trade. So the fossil record is fairly sparse. There aren't good historical records. And so we just don't know that much about their distribution across the landscape and what the effects of long-term widespread beaver engineering were. And beyond limiting our understanding of paleo ecosystems, this lack of evidence has fueled some controversy about where beavers belong and whether it's appropriate to reintroduce them to certain places like Southern California, for example, because many people still view beavers primarily as pests. And so this question of the role of beavers in paleo ecosystems is the driving motivation of this research, because you might imagine that 7 million years of ecosystem engineering might have played an important role in the evolution of our landscapes. So just, for example, maybe a larger proportion of our streams that look like this today historically looked more like this. So this question motivated a pilot study to see if sedimentary ancient DNA was a good technique for reconstructing past beaver activity, both as a way to develop a tool to understand whether beavers were historically native to a region, and more generally, to understand the dynamics of beaver-modified environments in the past and improve our understanding of ecological baselines. So this particular project focused on Grand Teton National Park. Beyond being an iconic national park, this area has a really well-described paleoclimatic history, and is actually one of the few places in North America where long-term beaver activity has actually been directly studied. So using geomorphic signatures of beaver damming, these authors Persico and Meyer, in a couple of papers about 10 to 15 years ago, identified beaver activity across the Holocene in this region. And so what they found was sporadic evidence of beavers in the early Holocene with greater activity after about 4,000 years, and then these gaps in the detection of beavers that they attributed to multi-century droughts. And so we wanted to see if we could recover a similar record of beavers in this area with sedimentary ancient DNA. And then we also wanted to look at the plant community in order to get a more holistic understanding of the role of beavers in this environment. So we got sedimentary ancient DNA from lake cores from these 3 lakes in Grand Teton National Park. The first 2, Taggart Lake and Jenny Lake, are in the Snake River Valley, and both of these have good beaver habitat in their headwaters and around the lakes. And then we also included a high elevation lake, Lake Solitude. We included this as sort of a control. It's up near tree line, and we didn't expect to see any beavers here. And we sampled over the past 10,000 years, looking for beavers in the plant community using our sedimentary ancient DNA. And I'm not going to get too much into methods, but just briefly, ancient DNA is challenging to work with. It is low in quantity, and low in quality. So it tends to be highly fragmented. If these streamers are our nice long pieces of modern DNA that are easy to analyze, our ancient DNA is more like the confetti. And this also makes it really prone to contamination. So whenever we analyze ancient DNA, we are suited up like this in dedicated clean rooms. And this isn't to protect ourselves, this is to protect our samples from us and our contaminating modern DNA. So yeah, any ancient DNA analysis involves a lot of hours of intensive lab work in the clean room. It's expensive, it's time consuming, and it has a high failure rate. So if you're ever seeing ancient DNA studies and you're unimpressed by the sample size or whatever, this is why. So coming around to our results, what did we find in terms of beaver presence? So as we expected, we didn't see any beavers in Lake Solitude, our high elevation control lake, but we did find a robust record of beaver activity in these other 2 lakes. So in Jenny Lake, we found beavers first showing up in the record 7,200 years ago, and then sporadically in the record until present. And then in Taggart Lake on the right, we see beavers first showing up a little bit later, but then they're continuously present in the record from 5,200 years ago until present. I mentioned earlier that this area has a well-described paleoclimate history, and so previous studies by my co-authors have shown that there was what's called a neoglacial advance in this region beginning around 6,000 years ago. This was basically a growth in the alpine glaciers in this region that they think was likely driven by an increase in winter precipitation. So this is kind of a busy figure on the left, but I'll just draw your, I'll just draw your attention to panel D, where you can see this increase in regional lake levels starting around 6,000 years ago. So I think that this increased water balance in the system is likely why we're seeing beavers show up around this time. Looking at some vegetation of interest, conifers are kind of a climatic indicator, and then poplars, willows, and aquatic plants are all preferred beaver food sources and are also associated with a more riparian or wetland potentially beaver-dominated environment. And so starting over in Taggart Lake on the left, right, where's my mouse? She gone, don't worry. In Taggart Lake, we see early in the Holocene, you can see it at the bottom, early in the Holocene, we see a more coniferous environment. And then when the beavers show up in the mid-Holocene, we see a shift to a more riparian environment with more of those poplars, willows, and aquatic plants. And we actually don't see aquatic plants showing up at all until the beavers do in this lake. This is kind of cool because we know that beavers potentially sort of plant their food sources or, probably bring them with them in their, in their scat and that kind of thing. In Jenny Lake, we see a similar pattern, but to a lesser degree. This is a bigger system, bigger catchment. So if beavers are driving this pattern, it would make sense that they're maybe less dominant in this system. And then interestingly, in Lake Solitude, we see an almost inverse pattern where we see more of that riparian regime early on, shifting to a more coniferous environment. And so again, I think we can invoke this neoglacial advance. At high elevation, Lake Solitude probably got a lot snowier and harsher during this neoglacial advance, whereas these low elevation lakes perhaps got more of that snow melt, which facilitated this more wetland or riparian environment. We also see a significant increase in plant diversity in these two lower elevation lakes in the mid-Holocene at that time of beaver arrival, whereas we don't see any change in Lake Solitude at the same time. And this is consistent with modern studies where we see beavers associated with an increase in plant diversity. So the major takeaways here. First of all, sedimentary ancient DNA seems to be a valid method for detecting the past presence of this major ecosystem engineer. We documented over 5,000 years of continuous beaver presence in this region and fine-scale regional dynamics. And this is a long time for an ecosystem engineer to be working in a single location. Think about the kind of landscapes that we know that humans have been engineering for at least 5,000 years. They're pretty heavily modified. So comparing our results to this previous study that looked at geomorphic patterns of beavers in this environment, we found a pretty similar record. We didn't find beavers as early as they did. Not sure why. It could be a sampling issue or a temporal limit of our assay. But we did see this kind of increase in the mid to late Holocene, similar to Persico and Meyer did. And interestingly, where Persico and Meyer found these gaps in the beaver record associated with these multi-century droughts, in Taggart Lake, we see beavers persisting through these time periods. And so this is suggesting maybe that in this small watershed, beavers may be exerting strong enough control to persist and maintain wetlands through extended periods of climatic stress. So this is just one preliminary result, but it's exciting thinking about how to mitigate the effects of climate change, right? Because it suggests that under certain conditions, maybe beavers can buffer the effects of drought at the local scale and provide refugia from plants and animals even over long timescales. We also see shifts in the plant community associated with this timing of beaver arrival from a more coniferous to a more riparian or wetland regime, and increased plant diversity. It's not super clear how much of this vegetation shift is being driven by the beavers or just by this neoglacial advance that's happening at the same time. And so we're hoping to repeat this study in more places to try to tease out that relationship. So returning to our initial questions, can we recover a record of past beaver activity with sedimentary ancient DNA? Yes, we can. What are the interactions between beavers, climate, and the plant community? It's interestingly, I would say, complicated and probably quite region specific. And so this kind of raises more questions than it answers, right? And so we are interested in seeing how widespread these patterns are. And so to answer this, we're essentially repeating this study in some different regions. So using sedimentary ancient DNA and other data from lake cores to look at the influence of beavers over the Holocene in different places. And so the driving question of this ongoing research is, are these patterns we see in the Tetons unique? What is the role of beavers in different environments? Because we know that beavers are present from the deserts to the poles, and they use different materials in those places, they eat different things. And then also, do we see evidence of beavers in regions where their nativity is disputed? So I'm currently focusing on two regions. The first is the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California. As we heard this morning, California is highly threatened by climate change, drought, and more intense and frequent wildfires. And these threats are driving a lot of interest and investment in beaver restoration, because we know that beavers are a really great, cheap way to mitigate these threats. And in particular, beaver dam systems, as Emily showed so well this morning, beaver dam systems are extremely resilient to fires, providing fire breaks and refugia. And so I'm interested in looking at the past dynamics of beavers in California, and particularly their relationship with fire. And we can actually look at the past record of wildfire in sediment cores using charcoal. And my other area of focus is the Alaskan Arctic. So beavers were not present in the Alaskan Arctic in the recent past and are currently moving in as the climate changes and the permafrost melts. And so we're interested in whether and when beavers were there in the slightly longer term history and their relationship to climatic changes in this region. So I don't have any results from these to share with you yet. I'm about 6 months into my postdoc research, but stay tuned for maybe the next BeaverCon when I'll hopefully have some results to share. So with that, I'll thank my co-authors and collaborators, and I don't know if I have time for questions, if we can take questions, but I'd be happy to if so. Yeah. The question is, could sedimentary DNA be preserved in wetland cores? Possibly. As I mentioned, ancient DNA is expensive and hard to do, and so we tend to focus on the places that have the best potential for preservation. Lake bottoms are good places for DNA preservation. They're cold, dark, anaerobic, and they tend to be easily datable, and people have been collecting lake cores for a long time. And so there's this really great record of them and all this other data that we can integrate. So we could potentially get ancient DNA out of other wetland cores or cores from other environments, but it's just trickier and it's a lot of work for potentially a low return. Does that make sense? Yeah, at the back. Wonderful question. The question was whether we could use the wonderful NSF archive of lake cores that's stored at the University of Minnesota, the Continental Scientific Drilling Program. The answer is yes, and I am doing that. So all of my, or most of my Sierra cores and my Alaskan cores are archived cores from the University of Minnesota. And so I spent my summer subsampling some cores, and I have my little sediment in tubes that I'm taking to the lab to process. Yeah. So this previous study looked at these like geomorphic signatures, right? There's also things like chewed sticks. So we know that there was beavers in eastern Arctic Alaska 8,000 years ago because there's beaver chewed sticks in like the geological layers. But they're not always preserved very well, so they're like more stochastic. And so where these forms of physical evidence are present, they're really great signatures of where beavers were, but they're not always there. And so sedimentary DNA is perhaps more reliable. Yeah. I'm not sure I really can. I'm not a geomorphologist. I can interpret the results, but I don't think I could provide a great summary of the methods. I encourage you to read those papers. It's really interesting work, but I'm not sure if I could do it justice. I think there's one more question, or maybe two. Yeah, go ahead. I think the causality is important when we're thinking about sort of political will. Having historical information that shows the beavers were here and they made these changes can help, when we're trying to decide, do we want to bring beavers into a certain area or do we want to protect beavers in a certain area? It can help us with that. Beyond that, I think it's just sort of interesting from a paleoecological perspective. Understanding these relationships tells us more about our world and helps us conserve environments, sort of broadly speaking. Can I take one more question at the back? Yeah. Yeah, it's honestly not an area I know a ton about. I'd like to learn more. Yeah, my background is pretty strongly molecular ecology, and so that's an area of growth for me, I'd say. But I'm interested in learning more about that perspective, and seeing that integrated more into these kinds of research. Yeah. All right, I'll close that there. Thank you.